All right, chapter 11, psychology and behavior. At this point in time, I am like 2 days ahead of the class. So I'm preparing this on November 7th. I'll be presenting on November 9th. So I can use a little bit of a time to catch up. Hopefully that happens soon. So we've talked about before that this class is there's a lot of things going on that are very speculative, largely because we don't have cavemen around to test and run these psychological batteries on. The evolution of psychology has a tendency to become an area that is even more speculative than most, simply because it's even harder to draw inferences on psychology, which is something that's generally, it's a hard field to study in general, just because a lot of times the effects are, it depends, right? There's a lot of variability in the population. A lot of these structures are very complicated. So it tends to be even more, this chapter is probably going to be more speculative than most. Most of these inferences come from cross-cultural studies. The idea being that if it exists in one culture, that doesn't tell you a whole lot, but if it exists in 5 or 6 cultures, and it's consistent across 5 or 6 cultures, then it might be something that's biological in origin. In the same sense, if we see it in animals, that's also evidence that it might be biological in origin because it's something going on in animals, and that particularly animals without culture, right? Yeah, it's just difficult to find support for these hypotheses. But I want to point out, just because it's difficult to support a hypothesis doesn't mean that it's incorrect. It just means we don't have support for it. A lot of these are really interesting to think about, but it kind of falls into more armchair philosophy than anything. So that's just something to be aware of. I wouldn't read too much into any of these things. If you're looking at the evolution of social behavior, it's informative to take a look at culture in animals. And different animals have different cultures. One of my favorite examples is actually birdsong. And so this guy, Steve Nowicki et al., he studied birdsong in swamp sparrows, and he recorded swamp sparrows at different areas of the country. Hudson Valley, the Adirondacks, Montezuma, Connecticut, Waterloo, and Wisconsin. I didn't even notice that before. But so they're in slightly different reasons, and he looked for various different attributes, and he noticed that they have these things called syllables, which are basically conserved regions of a song. And he found that the number of these syllables and how often they were repeated changed in different areas. And birdsong is actually a learned behavior in the vast majority of birds. And so birds in a local area learn their song from their father. And if all birds in a local area originally acquired their song from one individual, right? That was passed on from generation to generation, modified slightly over time. And so it makes sense that different areas have slightly different songs. But because this is a learned behavior, it's actually an example of culture, particularly if we define culture as information acquired through social learning. The other thing I love about this is that birds have dialects. And so like a bird from Boston and a bird from Georgia will have a slightly different dialect. And I just think that's really cool. Another example, whales do this thing called kelping behavior, where they would ride around with kelp on their foreheads. And there's actually some pretty decent evidence that it wasn't just like a weird phenomenon, but that it is something that occurs on a regular basis. And something that was done, it was a learned behavior, and they started doing it as a cultural behavior. The other thing that popped up in 2023, so relatively recently, is that orcas were attacking boats. And it's really strange, but that also appeared to be something where a particular pod learned to attack these boats, and there's no real value to it, but they did it almost because it became like the thing to do for orcas. Tool use in chimpanzees is a pretty famous example. I'm linking to a study right there. But a group of researchers followed around chimpanzees, and they found that some use sticks to get honey from a fallen log, while others use chewed up leaves. And they basically do the same thing, and both groups of organisms had the same set of tools available to them. But it seemed like one figured out that a stick does the job, and another one found out that chewed up leaves does the job. And so they shared that within their social group, and then it was passed on from individual to individual. if you're considering evolution of social behavior, you have to discuss the biological nature of behavior, right? And so this kind of harkens back to the nature versus nurture debates of the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s with guys like B.F. Skinner and Nico Tinbergen and Conrad Lorenz and all those different types. And there was a lot of argument, are we who we are because of our environment, or are we who we are because of our genes? And they went back and forth. And the thing about it is that these are both really reductive points of view, in that you're saying it's 100% nature or it's 100% nurture. Why couldn't it be 50-50, right? And so most biologists have determined that almost everything about us has some influence of our genes and some influence over our environment, but it's the intersection of those two where things get really interesting. Like how much of it is nature, how much of it is nurture is kind of more what we talk about now. And particularly when we talk about behavior, if you take the entirely like 100% point of view, you reach two inevitable conclusions. The first of which is if behavior is strictly genetic, then we aren't responsible for any of our behaviors, right? It's just our genes acting that way. And if you reach that conclusion, then sending someone to prison doesn't make any sense, right? Because what are they going to learn from it if they aren't going to change their behavior, right? And therefore, no one is responsible for their actions. And that doesn't feel right. That doesn't fit with our views. So most agree that it's at least somewhat the environment that you're exposed to. But on the other hand, if behavior had no genetic basis, then it isn't a biological phenomenon and it isn't worth studying. But they've done studies to show that, particularly twin studies, familial studies, and they've shown that some behaviors definitely have a familial origin. And the easiest example is to look at depression. Depression tends to run in families. Depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, all kinds of mental health disorders. And if those run in families, that means there's probably a genetic basis to it. If there's a genetic basis to it, then it is a biological phenomenon. It's worth our studying. So for the most part, it's nature or nurture, nature and nurture. It's how much is a natural versus how much is our environment. Social behavior also helps explain something else in biology that's really important. So oftentimes biology has questions about altruism. Why does altruism exist in social creatures? Why would somebody help somebody unrelated to them if it's of no benefit to themselves? But if you consider that organisms are social creatures and they have ranks in the social creature, it actually helps explain some of this behavior. So for instance, if you have pro-social genes, basically a gene for altruism, and those pro-social behaviors lead to increased status, that increased status will increase your reproductive success or your desirability for mates. And then that can cause your genes to proliferate in the environment, which will cause more pro-social genes to be expressed. So that is a partial explanation for why altruistic behavior could exist in humans and other social creatures. In addition, and that also works in addition to everything else we talked about with kin selection and reciprocal altruism and all that different stuff, as well as the prisoner's dilemma also plays into it. But yeah, and intuitively, this makes a lot of sense. If you think about people who do things that are altruistic, who are seen as doing things that are benevolent, we tend to think highly of those people. We tend to like those people, and they tend to have a higher social status. So that really makes a lot of sense to me, and I can understand how pro-social genes could actually be a fitness advantage, even if it does mean giving up resources, at least within, as long as you're giving up what you can afford to give up. The other thing to keep in mind with a social network is that having relatives in a social network is a huge environment or a huge advantage. And it's one of those funny things. Family tend to be the people who stick with you through thick or thin. They don't have to, and that's not true for everyone. And yeah, I strongly believe that family is the people who do stick with you through thick and thin, not the other way around. But in general, having relatives in a social network, they tend to be more reliable. And so that's just kind of a phenomenon of human nature. So we're going to talk a little bit about mate selection and infidelity broadly. And broadly, there's this narrative that amongst animals, males want to have as many offspring as they can have with as many different females as they can, and females want to be choosy about their mate. That doesn't really work with humans, though, because the cost of human development is so expensive. It makes monogamy the most viable strategy, right? Like both parents have to be there to be invested in the offspring for the offspring to have the best chance at being a successful individual. Um, so some of the concepts of mate selection that apply to a lot of other animals don't really apply to humans. This trend of humans towards monogamy also is further supported by the lack of sexual dimorphism. If sexual dimorphism is high, that's usually an indication of high intrasexual selection, where basically males fighting over each other, which is what you see in a lot of other primates. And then small testy size usually points to monogamy as well. It's not as important to produce more sperm than your competitors, so smaller testy size are not needed. So then the question becomes, what should females value in a mate? And the book posits that it should be resources, the amount of resources that an individual can supply. And I guess, that could be something that females are selecting for, but it doesn't take into account the sexy sons hypothesis, which basically says that if a female mates with an attractive male, she'll produce attractive babies, and those attractive babies will produce more babies because they're attractive, right? That's the sexy sons hypothesis. And that actually, that kind of makes sense. People like people who are good looking, and that's one of the things that people consider in a mate is, oh, he's so handsome or she's so pretty, right? So I think there definitely is something going on with the sexy sons hypothesis in human selection. I can see an argument for resources. It's kind of a crude argument, but people value people who are capable of doing good jobs, and which is a proxy of resources. However, whatever job you have, if it provides a lot of resources, then that's someone who is generally more attractive in our society. Like doctors are very attractive, at least anecdotally, but a lot of that is influenced by society and culture, right? The value of a job is dependent upon the culture that you're in. In some cultures, doctors are not highly paid at all, and sometimes throughout history, doctors were not well paid at all, right? That's more of a recent phenomenon. So there's certainly a cultural bias to that, and what do resources actually mean? The book also talks about risk taking, and it talks about how hypothetically females could prefer risky, risk-taking, daredevil type guys for short encounters, but they seek more stable individuals for long-term encounters. And the evidence for it seemed a little weak, and the book really didn't provide a whole lot of it. It would seem really speculative. But that's generally what the book talked about in female mate choice. It's probably a combination of a bunch of different things, to be honest. So that's kind of complicated. Male's value in a mate, and the book posits fertility. And my first question was, how is that determined? How would you determine if a female is reproductively viable through any external cues? Humans have discrete ovulation, so there's no signs if she's ovulating or not, and so you can't tell that. And the book points specifically to breasts and pelvis size. There's a quote from the book. It has been suggested that large breasts and pelvis have been interpreted as markers of capacity to give birth and nourish offspring. Well, the first thing I want to point out is that breast size doesn't correlate to milk production. That table 2 in the lower left-hand corner is various different factors of females that can be measured, and they tried to correlate with how much milk was produced, and the only one that came out significant is the age of the woman. I'm assuming younger, but I guess that's probably actually a bell-shaped curve, more so than anything. All the rest have no correlation at all. So breast size, for me, is not a marker of capacity to nourish, right? Now, it could have been interpreted that way by humans, because there is that cultural myth, but there's no actual evidence that that's what causes it, right? I looked into hip ratio, and I actually did find that mothers with a higher hip ratio, so wider hips to waist measurement, actually did produce larger babies. So there's something to be said about um, bigger hips being able to produce bigger babies. So that actually could make sense as a selective factor, but I don't know. Like, that doesn't necessarily, if a woman has big hips, it doesn't necessarily mean she'll be even able to have babies. So there's something there, or there may not be anything there. So I don't know. And then my partner actually pointed out to me that if fertility is what males should be selected upon, then mothers, women who have already given birth, should be the most desirable, right? Because they've already demonstrated that they're capable of having kids. And that doesn't seem to be the case in our society, at least not with my observation. But I haven't seen any studies that indicate that, and honestly, I can't claim to know that. So, yeah, I don't really know. Don't know. Um, Anecdotally, there is this narrative of women preferring older men and men preferring younger women, and this has been largely studied via survey. Um, and there seems to be at least some weak evidence that women prefer a slightly older partner and men prefer a slightly younger partner. But most of the data that I saw, it was within like 2 to 3 years. So we're not talking like 10 to 15 years difference. It seems slightly older. The thing about it is, though, is if you're conducting this via survey, you're really exposing yourself to cultural influence because there's just cultural taboos. And like a good example of this is Leonardo DiCaprio. And so he has never dated anyone older than the age of 25. And he's been getting a lot of flack in the media for this, but simply the fact of the matter that he is continually breaking up with women right before they turn 26. He's considered creepy because of that. And like, why doesn't he want to date women his old age? So giving someone a survey, they're aware of these cultural taboos and how well, the other side of the coin is that women who prefer older men, a lot of times they get strange looks, and I imagine the term gold digger is thrown around just because older men tend to have a little bit more wealth and have acquired more wealth. And so if you give a survey to people who are aware of these cultural taboos, it's going to influence their outcome of the survey. So I don't know how accurate those surveys actually are. And it seems like there's a really strong cultural influence to this. So I don't think we can reliably evaluate this, and I don't think we can make a reliable conclusion on this besides our individual speculation. So I tend to just kind of think, yeah, not so much. Like this doesn't really seem like it doesn't really seem like a very robust theory. It seems more of a cultural thing than anything. So infidelity. Infidelity is a thing that definitely exists, right? You can look across human cultures and cheaters exist. You simply have to look at the history of song and art and story to see that cheating exists in human society. And it also exists in humans or animal society. A lot of animal species that are quote unquote monogamous, actually you do find rates of infidelity. So this isn't just a human behavior, so it's something that exists. There's some data to say that men are more likely to cheat, but it doesn't seem like it's very strong evidence. It seems like just a slightly higher percentage of men cheat. It seems like women are more likely to have an emotional affair, where men are more likely to have a purely physical affair. And so for women, if it spills into the physical, it's something that started out as emotional. But again, there's strong cultural influences on this. And where I'm getting most of my information is the citation in the lower right-hand corner, if you want to take a look at this. So the question is, does it have an adaptive value? And people have put a lot of questions in this as an adaptive value. For males, it's fairly obvious. If a male can have offspring with one partner and then have offspring with another partner and have another male raise that offspring, he's increasing his fitness without providing any additional resources. Now, this is weighed by the cost of getting caught, right? Because if you get caught cheating, then that lowers your overall reproductive success because your partner's probably going to leave you, right? And if you don't have a partner, then you have no fitness. So there's certainly a cost with that. For females, it's a little bit more interesting because females can't really increase their fitness, like the number of offspring they can have with multiple partners, right? Like they still have the same reproductive capacity if they have two partners versus if they have three partners versus if they have one partner, right? Because they're limited in, at least human mammals. It's different in other organisms, of course. So the question is, why do females cheat? And a lot of people have spent time thinking about this. And so one of the theories is producing more diverse offspring, right? So if you have offspring from multiple different males, that causes, then you have more diverse offspring, which means that if the environment changes, then it's possible that some of your offspring will live, right? Because you have more diverse variety. And that seems to be the most likely explanation. Can't think of anything else. It's an interesting phenomenon that exists. All right, so now we're going to talk about emotions. And emotions are really powerful things. If you ask somebody why they did something, a lot of times they'll say, I don't know, I just felt like it. And so like feelings and emotions are not exactly the same thing, but they kind of seem to stem from this root place where it's like just something internal inside of you is guiding your choices and your decisions, right? And to give an example of like how our internal mental state can exhibit or can change our physical state, there's this test. It's called the elevated plus maze, and there's an image of an elevated plus maze at the lower right, and it's basically what it sounds like. It's a cross, right, that's up and elevated above the ground, and there's two different types of arms. There are the open arms and there are the closed arms, and in the closed arm, you're surrounded on three sides at all times, right? So there's no risk in you falling off, and there's no, like you're very safe and secure and you're protected in those little corners. If you go out on the exposed side, there's nothing around you. So you could fall off. If a predator would show up, you would be exposed, all those different things. And so researchers use these to study risk-taking behavior in mice. And then if you give them different drugs, they have different risk-taking behaviors. So diazepam, I was actually looking for cocaine because cocaine is the gold standard of this research. But I found diazepam, and diazepam is an anti-anxiety med. And as you see, if a normal mouse will spend most of its time in the closed arms, and it'll spend a little bit of its time in the open arms, kind of exploring things, and it won't go out. But if you give a mouse diazepam, it spends about the same amount of time in both arms. And so that's thought to be more risk-taking behavior, less risk-averse. And the diazepam is just reducing anxiety. And anxiety is really just a feeling. It's an emotion, right? It's an emotional state in response to a situation. And so when you say, I just felt like it, what you're saying is my emotions were guiding me to do this, right? Something in my biology was saying this is the right thing to do. Now, whether it is the right thing to do or whether it's not the right thing to do is a whole basis. The other thing we need to establish is that emotions have a biological basis, right? And we kind of talked about this a little bit. Going on to the next slide. So the easiest route for me to establish this is that hormones are associated with the behavior. Like, if you feel sad, it's usually because of cortisol. If you feel angry, it's because of epinephrine, right? And then the question becomes, are the hormones responsible for the behavior, or are they released in response to the behavior? Are the hormones in and of themselves necessary for the behavior, or are they necessary and sufficient? If it's just necessary, then you have to have the hormone in order to exhibit the behavior, right? So the easiest example for me is testosterone in male sexual behavior. Testosterone is necessary for male sexual behavior, but testosterone is not sufficient for male sexual behavior. There also needs to be estrogen, right? So you need both testosterone and estrogen. So testosterone would be necessary but not sufficient. The same thing works for females. They need to have estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, all of those different things. And so there's no single hormone that is necessary and sufficient for behavior, as far as I know. But the amount of hormones released does have a biological basis, right? That is under genetic control. And also the number of receptors that respond to the hormones and the different neural structures that modulate these behaviors are all under genetic control. So we all know people who are more emotional and reactive, and we know people who are calm, steady, and cool. And some of that is a factor of environment, but some of that is probably a factor of genetics and just the way people are. There are some people who just are slightly different than others, right? So it seems to me pretty logical that there are behaviors behind emotions, or there's biology behind emotions, right, behind those behaviors. And so we're going to kind of talk about some of those. The first is one that we talked about, fear and anxiety, right? Fear and anxiety is a response to a threat, either real or perceived. It's largely mediated by cortisol and adrenaline. Cortisol makes you more anxious. Adrenaline is more of an aggressive response. That activates your fight or flight response, more of an emergency state. And cortisol is mediated by the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. And I think it modulates adrenaline release, right? And so individuals with higher cortisol are more anxious, more fearful. Individuals with higher adrenaline levels would be more fearful, right? Another talk about is love. And so love can be explained in a biological setting. Basically, love is mediated by oxytocin, vasopressin, serotonin, and dopamine. And this image in the upper right-hand corner I thought was really interesting, and it shows the different areas of the brain that are activated when exposed to someone who has like maternal love, like a mother to a daughter, or a son to a mother, so on and so forth, versus romantic love, which would be a partner to a partner. And you can see that some areas are lit up by both behaviors, and some are only lit up by one. So these are different types of love, but it's mediating the behavior with the same basic sets of neurotransmitters. The other interesting thing about love is that love causes dopamine release. And there's a saying that you can only get addicted to dopamine, right? Because all drugs ultimately modulate dopamine in one way, shape, or form. And the act of being in love actually releases dopamine. And so when you're around that special somebody, your dopamine levels go up. And when you're not around them for a little while, your dopamine levels go down and you start to feel kind of crummy. And if you break up with them, that's kind of a rejection response, but also a lack of dopamine, which is similar to an addictive response. So you can actually describe love in the context of addiction. Another behavior we can talk about is sadness or depression. It's important to note that sadness and depression are not the same thing, right? Like sadness is transient, depression is really, really long term. And depression also has other markers associated with it, like lethargy and loss of appetite and all those different things that aren't necessarily associated with sadness overall. They're mostly mediated by cortisol, serotonin, and norepinephrine. We'll talk a little bit more about sadness and depression in a bit. Another emotion you can have is pride or shame. Pride or shame are both changes in response to social status, right? Pride would be an increase in social status, shame would be a decrease in social status, right? And these seem to be modulated largely by testosterone and cortisol as well. And so what they found was if you win a contest, your testosterone levels go up, but if you lose a contest, your testosterone levels go down. And this is true for both men and women, although the magnitude is different. But if you look at cortisol, you see the exact opposite reaction. If you win, your cortisol levels go down, or if you win, your cortisol levels go down, but if you lose, your cortisol levels go up. And this is, again, true for both men and women. So it's kind of interesting that pride and shame can be mediated by hormonal response as well. All right, moving on to something completely different. So there is this idea of inheritance in our society, and basically that's passing on wealth from one generation to another. It's likely that this is a very literal form of giving resources to your offspring, right? If you give your offspring resources, it's possible that they'll be able to require more mates and have more reproductive success. So it's actually kind of an act of extending your fitness, right, by increasing your offspring's potential fitness. The interesting thing about this is, in a lot of societies, in human societies, inheritance goes along the patrilineal line, from father to son, father to son, father to son down the line. It almost would make more sense for it to go on the matrilineal line, mothers to daughters, mothers to daughters. And the reason for this is, if a mother gives her money to her offspring, her female offspring, right, or if a father gives his money to a female offspring, anybody gives her money to a female offspring, any children that she has, that she passes the wealth on to, there's 100% guarantee that there's a relation there. But if a male gives all of his resources to another male, like his male offspring, his daughter-in-law could cheat on his son, and then you're passing your resources on to a third generation that is not related to you, right? So it almost would make more sense for there to be maternal inheritance. And some human societies do this, but it seems like the vast majority of them tend to run along male routes. In general, if there's a system where wealth is very closely correlated to success, it would make sense to pass it on, to concentrate your wealth in one individual, unless your wealth is very extensive and then spread it across many. It depends on how much resources you have. And in humans, that seems to be the case, because the eldest son has a tendency to inherit the vast majority of the resources, right? Or at least it's their opportunity to, they have the greatest opportunity to inherit those resources. So that would indicate that wealth is very closely related to success and status in our society, which you really don't need a whole lot of evidence to support that view. Something to talk about really, really quickly is that in group behavior, they talk about alpha males and alpha females in the book, and that is largely drawn from really shitty wolf research. And the guy who published that original study has actually redacted it and has very forcefully said that it was based upon poorly collected data, and specifically on captive wolves that were put into groups with forced, like they're not related. If you look at wolf packs amongst that are in the wild, what you actually find is that they tend to be family groups, right? Like all the individuals of the wolf pack tend to be, like the alpha male and alpha female are actually the parents. And all the other wolves tend to be siblings of each other. And that's why they share in so much of the care of offspring and so on and so forth. It's basically a parent and all of their kids. And then females and males will disperse and join other packs, or break out and start their own pack, depending upon how good times are and how rich resources are and so on and so forth. So it's important to understand that alpha male and alpha female are really not things that are biologically relevant. And I was really kind of surprised that the book used those terms, because we've known about that for quite a while. But broadly, if you look at group behavior, there's many different animals that exhibit group behavior. And it has to be advantageous or it wouldn't exist. And if you have group behavior, you have to have some sort of structural organization, right? And we've talked about this a little bit before, that Chimpanzees use fighting or Highland chimpanzees use fighting and grooming behavior to establish where people rank in terms of their society, and bonobos tend to use sex to establish that, and other different types of social organisms tend to utilize different ways to establish ranks. And there's a social structure in humans as well. If you look back at like the Middle Ages, they were called the estates: the first estate, second estate, and third estate. So the first estate was the clergy, the second estate was the nobles, and the third estate was everybody else, right? And they're increasing social status as you go up. The fourth estate, in case you haven't ever heard that term, is actually the press. The press is considered the fourth estate. So you'll hear that every now and then, and that stems from this basic division that somebody set up fucking long time ago. Who knows? But even if you look at modern times, there still seems to be an upper class, middle class, lower class. And that's largely based upon how many resources you have, right? And social class and social caste exist in almost all human societies, right? So the social structure is meaningful and it does matter. Okay? This is just the quote that establishes the fourth estate, right? And it's a British term, right? The other thing to keep in mind is that if you have a social structure, there has to be punishment for cheaters. And that is largely jail. We throw cheaters in jail. That's how we establish the social rules. That's how we enforce our social codes and our social values about what is wrong and what is not wrong. Another thing to consider when we talk about group behavior is religion. And so I'm looking at this strictly from a scientific point of view, because that's the point of view of a class that we should use in a science, right? So any benefits from religion that are supernatural are simply beyond the scope of this course, and we're just not going to take it. But I'm going to admit that it is a limited point of view, and it's actually a hard science point of view, because you could also look at it from a psychological point of view, a sociological point of view, a philosophical point of view, all different kinds of point of view. So it's very limited. But the fact that religion is present in nearly every society raises the question, is this something that is adaptive, or is this just something that's a byproduct of our brains? And there's a couple different explanations for how it could be adaptive beyond the supernatural, even without the supernatural. So part of it is just group cohesion. If everybody has the same religion, that provides you with an in-group and an out-group, right? The in-group is everybody who is in your religion, and the out-group is everybody else. And any kind of sacrifice to your religion, like tithing or giving up crops or whatever else not, is seen as commitment to that group. And that commitment is an investment, and people have a tendency to value their investments, and they want their investments to work out. So it could be a social cohesion point of view. The other thing to point out is that a lot of religions have ritualistic behavior. So kosher is a process for preparing animals before eating them. And there's a lot of cultures around the world that do not eat certain things or do eat certain things, or they have hand washing or cleansing rituals that are very common with various different religions. And if you think back to like 5,000 years ago, when parasites were much more common and modern medicine wasn't as advanced, a lot of these cleansing behaviors and food preparation behaviors could have been adaptive in that you're avoiding parasites and you're just generally avoiding things that would make you sick. And so, for instance, pork is a really good example, because wild pork is loaded with parasites, right? And so that's why you used to have to cook pork to like 185 degrees before it killed all the parasites so it was edible. Modern pork is treated with antibiotics and antiparasitics and antifungals and all that cool stuff. So you can actually eat pork at 165. Like, you can cook it to the same temperature as a steak, and you don't need to cook it nearly as high. The FDA has supported this. Restaurants have known about this for decades. But it's just modern pork, it has very much lower parasite load. So you don't have to cook it nearly as much as you used to. You can treat it a lot like beef, to be honest. But a lot of religions actually avoid pork completely. There's Islam, Judaism, and I believe Hinduism do not eat pork, to the best of my knowledge. And it's thought actually that by avoiding pork, you're avoiding parasites. So even though you're closing out that food resource, if it's so loaded in parasites, it might make you healthier individuals overall. And that's not even taking in like the food preparation that is sometimes religiously affiliated. So there could be adaptive ritualistic behavior in religion as well. Supernatural explanations are totally possible too. They're just beyond the scope of this course. So if we look at evolution in society, mental health disorders affect up to 25% of people in Western societies in various different forms. This is a graph for depression, and it's just looking over a 10-year span, and you can see it went from 6.6% to 7.2%. And there's been a lot of research out there that a lot of mental health disorders are increasing. Like ADHD is something that really wasn't diagnosed prior to the 1970s. And and there's more people who have that, autism spectrum disorders, depression. And so the question is, are these actually increasing, or is it our increased awareness of them, or is it the reduced stigmatization of them? And that's a really, really interesting question that I think we need to answer, but I don't think we have enough data to actually provide convincing evidence for it, let alone define what the cause of it is. There might be evolutionary reasons why mental health disorders are increasing, if they are in fact increasing, right? That could be biological and not so much sociological. So previously we talked about genes can influence hormones, they can influence neurotransmitters, the amount of neurotransmitters, the clearance of neurotransmitters, the organizations of neural networks, and each of these can alter a behavior. If you have any behavior to the extent where it's clinically significant, it becomes a mental disorder. And that's basically taken straight from DSM-5. DSM, that's the definition in the upper right-hand corner. Syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotional regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental functioning. And clinically significant is significant to me. That is a very important word. It has to be something that is measurable in some way, shape, or form, or it has to be causing an impact on the patient's life, right? It has to be negatively impacting them for it to be truly a disorder, right? If it's not impacting someone's life, then it's really not something to be worried about, right? So also, if you consider personality, personality is somewhat inflexible behavioral patterns, right? And personality is something that exists. Some individuals have a very short temper. Some individuals are very calm and laid back. And this is also identifiable in animals. Anybody who's ever looked at a pet will identify that some pets that you've had are laid back, and some are excitable, and some are calm, and some are cool. So this isn't something that really requires a whole lot of explanation. And it's just based upon the different neural circuitry going on. So if any particular aspect of a behavior is exaggerated, it can become maladaptive, right? And so we're going to talk about some of those maladaptive ones and how they could possibly be beneficial under a more narrow circumstance, right? So for instance, paranoia is vigilance and skepticism of outsiders. And in normal levels, it's reasonable to be skeptical of outsiders. It's reasonable to say, hey, I don't know you. I don't really know about you. You kind of got to earn my trust before you have my trust. Paranoia is to the degree where you don't trust people who should be trusted, right? Where you start to question the relationships in your life and if they actually love you and all this different stuff. And it can be a very, very dangerous situation for someone to be in. If you think about, vigilance can be definitely adaptive. It's just when it gets to be hyper-vigilant. And also, you can think about this from a group selective point of view. If you have a certain frequency in the population of people who are paranoid, it could be beneficial to have a couple group members in your society who are like, hey, I don't want to trust any outsiders because we don't know about them. Let's just keep it to this group. And even if the group overall doesn't listen to that person, just having their input might actually help the group overall. So you can kind of look at it from like either a balancing selective point of view or a group selection point of view. Either one is fine. Antisocial personality behavior is marked by a wide variety of behaviors that are really, really difficult to deal with, right? They just tend to thrive on chaos. And it tends to be just behavior that's just not cooperative, right? Like lying, cheating, stealing, no remorse, um, wanting to be the center of attention, always wanting to shake things up. But it's just broadly not cooperative behavior. And so one of the things you learn from the prisoner's dilemma is that if you run through those various different models, if there's a few cheaters in the society, everything still works out just fine, so long as there's not too much cheaters in the society. If you get too many cheaters in the society, trust breaks down completely, right? But if you just have a few, it can be maintained. So antisocial behavior can broadly be thought of as that's the cheater behavior. And so it could be maintained in a population so long as there's not too many of them. And how many can be maintained is dependent upon a variety of different factors, which include the payoffs for cheating. Phobias are really interesting because some phobias are like, duh. Like fear of snakes is a totally rational thing, right? Like there's a lot of snakes that are venomous. It's totally rational to be afraid of them. Same with spiders. All spiders are venomous, right? There are some things that you should not be afraid of, and these are a list of them. Like for instance, fear of marriage would definitely be something that wouldn't be rational. Fear of the cold isn't something that's really rational. Fear of heights isn't something, well, that's actually fairly rational. That's a dangerous situation. But it becomes a phobia when it becomes crippling, right? Like you're so afraid of a spider that even seeing a fake spider would stop you from going out. And like, that basically means you couldn't leave the house in October because there's spiders everywhere. So that's where it blurs the line into like a disorder. Anxiety is kind of an interesting one because in dangerous situations, timid individuals tend to survive. If you're a bold individual and you're in a highly dangerous situation, you tend to stand out, you tend to get picked apart, you tend to be the person who is eliminated from that population. So anxiety can be advantageous in bad times. Times are a lot better now than they were 50 years ago, 500 years ago. By any objective measure, you're probably better off than your ancestors were. That may be changing very rapidly, but in general, that is true. So in a dangerous situation, having anxiety could be a beneficial trait. But in situations like now, when things are relatively safe and stable, and there's not frequent risk at you at every corner, it can limit your social interactions. And if you limit your social interactions, that can hurt your social status, and hurting your social status hurts your status in society. Well, it's kind of a redundant phrase, but you get what I'm driving at. So anxiety could be maladaptive if it's in the extreme. Okay. So depression is something that I'm particularly interested in. And it's very likely that depression has an environmental and a genetic component. So they've done studies where they look at across families, and if your parents have depression, you're more likely to have depression. So there's definitely a genetic characteristic to it. And if your siblings have depression, you're more likely to have depression too. It's likely a polygenic trait because it's not just straight Mendelian, like you have it or you don't. And it exhibits a spectrum. Like there's people who are mildly depressed, and there are people who have crippling depression where it vastly inhibits every aspect of their life. And there's some people who show no depressive behavior whatsoever. And so it's very likely a polygenic but heritable suite of genes. But it also has an environmental component. And the environmental component is definitely something that's very interesting. So they looked at a variety of factors in the study, and I can't remember where I found the study, but those are the ones listed before. You can see the p-values are very highly significant for all these behaviors, right? If you feel loved by someone, you're much less likely to have depression. If you feel hated by a family member, you're much more likely to. If you're physically abused, you're much more likely to. If you were molested, you're much more likely to. And interestingly enough, if your mother smoked, you're much more likely to have depression as well. And they looked at this in females and males across behaviors. They looked at the age of onset. They did a whole bunch of correlations. But basically, they found out consistently that these 5 things had a significant reaction. So there's something in the environment. Like your environmental exposure definitely increases your likelihood of getting depression. So it has an environmental component. It has a genetic component like everything else. Is it more environmental? Is it more genetic? I don't know. Okay. You'd have to look at concordance studies, and I didn't really get into that. I want to point out that what I'm talking about, and really with all these behaviors may have been advantageous in the past, but we live in a different situation than our brains evolved for. And so it could be a situation where something that was adaptive is no longer adaptive. It's also important to keep in mind balancing selection. Some of these depressive type behaviors could be advantageous at a certain level in the population, which would make them more common to be in the heterozygous state. But they could be deleterious in the homozygous state, right? Much like sickle cell anemia, if you remember talking about that, that's another balancing depression. And like I said previously, it's definitely a polygenic trait. So if you have some of these genes, it might be advantageous, but if you have too many of them, it could be deleterious. So I want to talk about some possible mechanisms that may maintain these alleles and how it could be adaptive. So the first one they talked about is the psychic pain model. And so pain indicates some kind of threat to your fitness, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a physical threat. It could also be an emotional threat. Like your body really doesn't differentiate between psychic pain and physical pain. And so depression could be a reaction to that pain. So if you have a loss in social rank, it kind of makes sense to withdraw for a little while and think about your situation and evaluate where you are and what to do next. And so sadness could be a result of that social pain, that psychic pain that you're experiencing. Depression would be when you get stuck in a feedback loop, right? Where you have the social pain, which causes anger, anxiety, negative emotions, decreased mood, withdrawing from society, which is depression, and that increases your perception of pain, which then causes more pain, right? So that's one model of what depression is. Another model is the behavioral shutdown model. And so with behavioral shutdown model, what's happening is whatever caused the pain, right? Whatever caused the sadness is indicating that the world is not good and it's not likely to improve and get any better. In a situation where the world is not good, it's best to be timid and withdraw, reduce contact with others, and hunker down and try to protect what resources you have. Basically, it's saying the world is a dangerous place. Let's avoid other people as much as we can. It's similar to kind of learned helplessness. This can also explain in utero development of depression. So if the mother has high cortisol levels, that's a signal to the offspring that the world out there is not a pleasant place. And so maybe it's best to have a withdrawn personality. The last model was analytical rumination, is what it's called. So basically, something bad has happened. Something has happened that's causing psychic pain, and you need to figure out why. If you can find a solution and then you find yourself in a similar situation, it's very possible that you could do a different behavior which will lead to success, right? And we tend to do this. Like if something doesn't go well, you tend to be like, God, that really didn't go well. I could have handled that better. I could have done this. I could have done this. Maybe I should try this next time if that happens again, right? And so that analytical rumination can be adaptive, right? Because in the next time you come across that situation, you're like, oh, I know what to do, this. Depression is basically when you over-ruminate and you overthink about it. And you start to beat up on yourself for your behavior, even though you did the most rational thing in that situation. Or if you focus on unsolvable problems. So for instance, sometimes you're stuck in a situation that just sucks and you can't get out of it, and that could very easily lead to a negative feedback loop. And also from a group selective perspective, having a certain number of individuals in a group that will ruminate on these things and think about these things and try to solve answers for the entire group could be beneficial to the group overall. And so that would help maintain it in the population, either through balancing selection or through group selection. All right, that's it. Peace out. See you Thursday.